been a while since I've done one of these videos, and I thought it was high time for me to get back into gear with this series, most of which is still on the Anti-Trigger channel, by the way, so check those out if you haven't already, and then come right back here for more recent ones. I did a video on the USS Defiant from a submariner's perspective last year, and I wasn't altogether happy with it, so I ended up taking it down. It was one of those first videos I did, and I knew even less about what I was doing back then than I do today, so I wanted to take another crack at this concept. My opinions on the Defiant have also changed a bit over the last year, and I wanted to make a new video that reflected that. For Andrea Seabrook and all the rest of you normies out there who don't know much pop culture lore, and Star Trek lore specifically, the USS Defiant was a ship featured on the television show Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the most unique of all real Star Trek shows to date, and my personal favorite. The show centered around the people who lived and worked on the titular space station, a behemoth structure that served as a kind of frontier town. The station itself was not constructed by Starfleet, the organization most Star Trek characters belong to, but the station was administrated by Starfleet and was under the command of Commander, later Captain, Benjamin Sisko, played by Avery Brooks. That's right, all you Secret Hideout fans. Michael Burnham wasn't the first lead who happened to be black in a Star Trek production, nor was she even the first female lead, for that matter. Unlike most Star Trek shows, only about half of the cast of characters on Deep Space Nine belonged to Starfleet. The other half were civilians or belonged to other uniformed services. When under-producer Ira Steven Behr began taking over the show toward the end of the second season, he was interested in picking up the action level of the series. Up until this point, wars and battles were things that were always talked about on Star Trek, but seldom if ever actually shown on screen. This was partly due to Gene Roddenberry's influence and ridiculous ideas about what humanity would be like in the future. Humanity, to Roddenberry, would have evolved past conflict and drama by the 24th century. This is an interesting idea, but it doesn't lend itself to very exciting television, or films for that matter. Initially, executive producer Rick Berman was opposed to the idea of putting a starship on the show. After all, the whole idea of Deep Space Nine was that it took place on a space station that didn't go anywhere. That's what made it unique. Behr, in contrast, however, wanted the show to be about a specific region of space, with the station as its center. To facilitate travel to other nearby planets, the show and station initially had very small shuttle-like starships called runabouts, but these would be inadequate for what Behr had in mind. At that time, Berman was preparing a series for the new UPN TV network called Star Trek Voyager, which was another Star Trek show that would be taking place on an advanced ship. But eventually, Berman acquiesced under the condition that this new ship for Deep Space Nine had to be small. Behr, along with series writer Ronald D. Moore and others, came up with a concept for a Starfleet vessel that had one singular purpose. While most of other ships we'd seen in the franchise could fulfill more than one role, this new ship would be designed pretty much for one thing. While the original Enterprise on the original series had a 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, this new ship would be, as Behr put it, on a 5-year mission to kick ass. It had been previously established in Star Trek that while most Starfleet vessels had weapons, they were not to be thought of as warships. This new ship was certainly going to break with that long-held Roddenberry edict, but luckily there was a way to do it that made sense. In the previous Star Trek series, The Next Generation, a new adversary for the Federation called simply the Borg was introduced. The Borg were a race of cybernetic zombies that, like regular undead zombies in horror films, sought to figuratively consume other races and cultures and turn at least some of them into fellow Borg. Their massive cube ships were seemingly unbeatable, as the Borg had the ability to quickly adapt to new technologies like weapons and also strategies. The Borg served as a kind of wake-up call to Starfleet, so it would make sense that Starfleet would begin changing their habits in the face of such an enemy. In the second season finale of Deep Space Nine, a new nation threat emerged called the Dominion, whose military, the Jem'Hadar, destroyed the USS Odyssey with relative ease. This is significant because the Odyssey was Galaxy class. the same class of ship as the Enterprise from the Star Trek The Next Generation series, a show, by the way, whose series finale had aired just the week before. This sent a strong message to the audience. You see, the Galaxy-class starships had been portrayed for the last 7 years as the most powerful ships in Starfleet. They were the biggest, fastest, and most heavily armed ships Starfleet had ever produced up until that point. For the Dominion to so handily destroy one of them in their first engagement with Starfleet meant that, like the Borg, Starfleet may not have been up to the task of standing up to the Dominion, to say nothing of actually defeating them if they ever went to war. Thus, the USS Defiant made her debut in the 3rd season premiere. Described as a prototype for a new type of ship, euphemistically designated as an escort vessel, the Defiant was described as a very flawed but powerful ship, originally designed to fight the Borg. The Defiant, as originally introduced, was dangerous, not only to the enemy but also to the crew who manned her. The ship was overgunned and overpowered for a ship her size, and could potentially tear itself apart or blow herself up if used at full capacity. Eventually, however, the ship became as stable and reliable as any Starfleet vessel, mostly thanks to the most important man in Starfleet history, Chief Miles O'Brien. Once O'Brien and his engineering team worked out all the bugs and fixed all the ship's problems, Starfleet began mass-producing the Defiant-class ships, later seen in episodes of Deep Space Nine and even Voyager. The original Defiant was legally equipped with a Romulan cloaking device. For those of you who don't know, a cloaking device in Star Trek is a device that makes the ship practically invisible and undetectable to other ships. It's mostly used by 2 political powers in the franchise, the Romulans and the Klingons. The Federation, the nation that Starfleet serves, signed a treaty many decades before the shows started, agreeing to never pursue cloaking technology for their ships. With one exception, Starfleet has never broke that treaty. With her cloaking device, Defiant could take on submarine-like missions, but this was relatively rare on the show. Defiant wasn't so much an espionage or sneak attack platform as it was a pure fighting vessel. There are some people out there who feel the Defiant just doesn't look like a Starfleet vessel and constantly dismiss it as such. The Defiant does differ from conventional Starfleet design concepts in that the ship is essentially one piece. It's basically a saucer that has had her nacelles hard-mounted directly to the hull. The forward deflector module protrudes from the front of the saucer to form a kind of ram for when the ship needs to plow through other ships and debris. I disagree with the naysayers. It's clearly made of Starfleet materials, and the saucer element, while heavily modified, is still present. Starfleet tends to mount their nacelles on pylons or struts to keep them away from the rest of the ship as a kind of security precaution. But lots of other ships from other nations, especially the more aggressive ones, don't do this. Clearly the pylons aren't 100% necessary, just preferred by Starfleet. Something else I've always found interesting about the Defiant is that it doesn't really look like a warship. If you didn't know it was supposed to be a warship when you first saw it, you probably wouldn't think it is based on how it looks, at least until it fires its weapons. Other warships in Star Trek are pretty obviously warships, like the Klingon Bird of Prey with its large wing-mounted disruptor guns, or the Vorcha-class attack cruiser with its big, obvious front-facing weapon. The Defiant's weapons, on the other hand, are very understated, and I can remember being genuinely surprised when she first cut loose with her weapons blazing. The Defiant's signature weapons are her forward-firing, rapid-fire pulsed phaser cannons. These weapons differ from the kinds of phasers used by most other Starfleet vessels we'd seen in that they are not a steady, continuous beam, but rather bolts. In Darren's head cannon, these burst phasers are probably more powerful at closer ranges than standard beam phasers, but probably can't reach as far as standard beam phasers. That certainly seems to be the case based on on-screen footage. The ship also has standard beam-type phasers on other surfaces, most notably the aft, dorsal, and ventral sides. The Defiant was also the first ship we'd seen to carry a new kind of torpedo called a quantum torpedo. These new torpedoes were bluish-white rather than orangish-red like the photon torpedoes we'd seen before. According to the Deep Space Nine technical manual, the quantum torpedo had roughly twice the explosive yield of a photon torpedo, but that was never officially stated on screen. The overall impression one gets from these armaments and designs is that the Defiant could take it to the enemy as aggressively as the enemy could take it to someone else. The Defiant was also not deployed the same way other ships we'd seen were deployed. You wouldn't send the Defiant out on a 5-year mission to explore, for example. It just wasn't designed for a mission that long. It also wouldn't be the best choice for a planetary survey mission if you were interested in getting lots of detailed information. I mean, it could run some scans, sure. Its sensor package is probably at least as good as that of a runabout, but you're not going to get the kind of detailed information that a pure science vessel would get. Incidentally, the Defiant was sent out on a planetary mission in one episode of Deep Space Nine, but it made sense in that story since the planet in question was in the highly dangerous Gamma Quadrant. Defiant didn't have a standing crew like other ships we'd seen either. Sisko decided who took it out. Sisko was often in the big chair, but we also saw Lieutenant Dax, Major Kira, and Lieutenant Commander Worf command the Defiant at various times. We'd also seen them man the helm as well. Even Garrick, a civilian who was also a former member of the Cardassian Obsidian Order, manned a station once in a while. The Defiant can be thought of as a vehicle asset rather than a straightforward command like the Enterprise. So how big is the Defiant? Well, it's on the small side for sure, coming in at 560 feet in length. It's one of the smallest hero ships in the franchise. Interestingly, the ship's size was in constant flux on the show due to the fact that they used a physical model most of the time, and the fact that you need to be able to see the ship in shots. Here's what I mean. Here's a still from the show, commonly used, stock footage, showing the Defiant docked at the station. Here's a fan-made image showing the ship docked the same way as well, on the outer docking ring. Now here's a shot from the show of a Galaxy-class ship docked at the station in one of the upper pylons. You can tell that the Defiant's size is significantly increased in the first shot for, among other reasons, so you can see the ship. If they used the actual scale of the Defiant to show it docked at the station, it would look something like this instead. As you can see, this wouldn't really work for beauty shots of the ship, and the station together. The Defiant originally had a shuttle bay directly beneath the bridge with one tiny shuttle pod and a drop door design, kind of like what they used later with the NX-01. We only saw this once to my knowledge, and this was only in the ship's first appearance, since it was never brought up again and honestly seems a bit too much for a ship this size. Darren's headcanon says that the shuttle and shuttle bay were eventually replaced with something more valuable, like the workshop where O'Brien prepped mines for deployment in the episode A Call to Arms. One of my favorite sets on the show was the engineering set for this ship. It had all the design elements of the Enterprise D's engineering set, just in a more compact form. It reminded me of a submarine's engine room the same way the NX-01's engine room did. It was clean and powerful looking. Okay, now let's compare the USS Defiant to my old ship, the USS Trepang, SSN 674. Special thanks once again to MetaBallStudios for this animation, showing the Defiant at 560 feet long to the Trepang at a length of 292 feet. What I'm about to say may shock some of you, but I don't consider the Defiant class to be the Star Trek equivalent of a submarine, as much as, say, the smaller Klingon birds of prey.
What the hell? What is this?
This is because the Defiant class wasn't actually designed for stealth. The first Defiant was legally equipped with a cloaking device, as mentioned earlier, but that was a one-time arrangement, an amendment to the Treaty of Algeron. That's the treaty in which the Starfleet and Federation agreed not to pursue or use cloaking technology. Nobody knows what the Romulans agreed to give up in that treaty. Probably nothing. If only the Federation had leaders who understood the art of the deal. But I digress. The real reason why I can't call the Defiant a submarine stems from how well armed and maneuverable she is. Historically, submarines are some of the least armed warships in the U.S. Navy. Trepang carried around 24 or so Mark 48 torpedoes at the time I served on her, and that was it. Compare that to a destroyer, like those of the Arleigh Burke class, which have deck guns, Sea Whiz, a butt-ton of various missiles, and torpedoes. The only chance a submarine has against something like that is when it's submerged, and then they have to worry about depth charges and sonobuoys. There's a reason why they are called destroyers, after all. The Navy has a word that describes a submarine that is forced to fight on the surface, and that word is fucked. While it is true that some submarines fire intercontinental ballistic missiles and others can fire Tomahawk missiles, they're still generally regarded as not being as well armed as their surface counterparts when it comes to ship-to-ship combat. The Defiant, in contrast, is more well armed than most of the other ships in Starfleet. Submarines are also some of the slowest vessels in the U.S. Navy. My old boat, Trepang, had a flank bell of about 25 knots, give or take a knot or two depending on currents. That's about 28 miles per hour, by the way. Defiant, in contrast, is highly maneuverable at sublight speeds, and her warp speed is somewhere around average for Starfleet. While the Defiant isn't as much of a submarine as a lot of people think, there are still some similarities that she has with submarines that other Starfleet vessels don't have. For example, the crew accommodations. On the USS Enterprise D, most of the crew quarters we saw looked like something out of a Marriott convention center. Each example of quarters even had a food replicator. On Defiant, every room was designed for two and had bunk beds. There was also only one food replicator on the ship, and that was in the crew's mess, the place that Star Trek consistently misidentifies as the mess hall. That is, there is only one food replicator on the ship, except when a script needed there to be one elsewhere for the episode Defiant. In this early episode, Kira was confined to quarters by hijackers, and she modified a replicator in those quarters to sabotage the ship's cloaking device. But this is the only example of a replicator being in the Defiant's crew quarters. Most other depictions of Defiant crew quarters do not include a food replicator. Defiant's interior passageways and bridge were also much smaller than what we'd seen before, comparable in size to those of the sets on the later Star Trek Enterprise series. In summation, I don't think the Defiant is as good a submarine comparison as, say, a Klingon bird of prey, mostly because while the original Defiant carried a cloaking device, the ship wasn't really designed for one, and neither was the class. Without the cloaking device, the only similarities the Defiants have with submarines are their relative size compared to their respective fleets and the relative lack of room inside for the crew. Still, compared to USS Trepang, serving on a ship with the same accommodations as the Defiant would have been considered luxurious. If you'd like to support this channel, like, share, and subscribe. Also consider buying a copy of my book, Captain Steele and Other Stories, on Amazon. The link will be in the description. It's speculative fiction, and if you like stories like those featured on the classic Twilight Zone show, I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks for watching.
You lied? I don't care!